Good morning, Hope Church family. It's my privilege to be able to share the midweek encouragement with you again. And I'm going to take a different approach today. I thought about what I would like to do, and it's what I came up with is that I would like to share a little bit of my testimony with you. And so that's what I'm going to do. Just get my Bible ready to share a verse with you later. But I grew up in northern Maine, in a little town called Ashland. And I grew up in a Christian family. I was born into a Christian family. My parents received Christ before I was born. And both sets of grandparents on my mom and my dad's side were both Christians as well before I was born. And so my life as a young child was pretty typical for, an American Christian family. I grew up, my brothers and I have two brothers, grew up going to church. We attended Sunday school. When we got older, we attended youth group. In the summers, there was a camp up there, a Christian camp, Camp Namaka. I attended that regularly every summer. And I was baptized at a young age. I think I was 8 when I was baptized. My early teenage years, so pretty average childhood, right? Nothing too crazy. But as I became a teenager, my early teenage years is really where I began to stray from the faith that I was being raised in. Primarily, I was a liar. And that manifested itself in many, many ways, and mostly through being deceptive about my relationship with girls from school and things like that. The reality of it all is that I loved myself more than anyone else. I loved giving myself what I wanted more than I loved obeying my parents, more than I loved honoring my grandparents in the way that I lived. And especially, I loved myself more than I loved God and desired to honor Him with obedience in my life. And one of the net results of having all these lies, so I would lie to my friends, I would lie to my teachers, I would lie to my parents and my brothers about these relationships and about different things in my life. And one of the things that became very difficult is I developed a lot of anxiety trying to keep every strand of the web of lies going, trying to keep it all up in the air, became very difficult. And one day near the end of the school year, I got caught red-handed, dead set in a lie. And everything just slowly fell apart within a couple of days. And my worst nightmare was happening. And the sad part is my worst nightmare, more than anything else, my worst nightmare wasn't the lies, it was getting caught. That's a subtle difference, but that's the reality, is I was more afraid of getting caught than I was about lying. And so my parents being good parents, right? I got caught in this web of lies and everything unraveled, and the depth of my lies were found out. And so my parents being good parents grounded me for an extended period of the summer. And one of the other consequences is I had to take a trip with my dad. My dad at the time was a truck driver. He used to do long haul trips around the country, and I had to start my summer by going on a trip with Dad to spend some time thinking about life. And it was during that trip, my dad had me read some scriptures. We had very man-to-man talk about how my disobedience was affecting the family and affecting he and my mom. And it was heartbreaking, actually. For the first time ever, I began to feel a little guilty for what I had been doing. When we returned home from that trip, I think it was like a 2-week trip, my parents made me apply to work at a camp, a summer camp, the one I had been attending, Camp Namaka, and I applied to be on staff, even though I was clearly not a Christian, and instead of doing the right thing and being honest on my application, I lied. I didn't tell my parents, but I lied about being a Christian or where my faith was at that time, because I thought that would be my best chance at getting there. And so by the grace of God, by God's sovereignty, I got accepted to work at Namaka. And it was there that God used the gospel to penetrate my dark heart and my very dead heart. And as a staff member at Namaka, that's the sad reality, is I wasn't a camper, I was on staff, and it was there that God used the gospel to penetrate my heart. Very clearly, one night, the director of camp was presenting the gospel as clear as could be. And in that moment, I realized the gravity of my lying, of my sin, of my selfishness before God. The wages of my sin was death. I realized I was dead. And it was in that moment, or it was that evening, that I continued just to kind of think about my life and the path I was on, and realizing that the end result of that path was death. It was that night in bed I accepted Christ as Lord, but in reality it was God who had already done the work in my heart, and I was just acknowledging the truth for the first time as reality, okay? That Jesus is Lord, that his work on the cross paid for my sin. All of that finally made sense. And since that time, Hebrews 7:25 has kind of become the verse that I use to, the verse that resonates with my life and my story. Hebrews 7:25 says this. Actually, Pastor Doug used it a few weeks ago during one of his Sunday sermon videos. And so here it is again, Hebrews 7:25. Consequently, he, and here it's talking about Jesus, so consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. That night when I heard the gospel and understood the gravity of my sin, the magnitude of the work of Christ, the goodness of God, I felt as though I was the uttermost sinner. I got it. I understood. I've never felt the weight of anything. I had never felt the weight of anything before that time. And in that moment, I felt the weight of my sin, the deadness of my heart. But I also felt in the gospel that I understood not only how deadly my sin was, but how great Jesus is. And so Hebrews 7:25 just continues to resonate with me. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost. I felt like I was the uttermost. Those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And what's true, okay, so my story is a bumpy road, right? But the truth is that all of our stories about coming to faith are miraculous, no matter what. You know, and my wife, Hannah's testimony is different than my testimony. Her story about coming to know Jesus is different than my story. And it's a lot less traumatic in some ways. But the same God who penetrated my dark heart, my heart of stone, also did the same work in Hannah's life. Except Hannah grew up in a Christian home, grew up in church, and wasn't overly disobedient, and didn't have all those bumps in the road. And yet her story and my story are the same thing. Jesus went to the cross to pay for our sin. And that miracle, that is the goodness of God. That's a supernatural thing, right? Jesus did what we didn't want to do. We couldn't do, we wouldn't do, right? And so her story is just as significant as my story because it's the story of the goodness of God. And the same is true for your story. Your story matters because your faith displays God's goodness, his mercy. He went to the uttermost by sending Jesus to the cross for your sin, for my sin, for our sin, so that you would become his people. And the wonderful thing is that because you belong to Jesus and because Jesus is alive, you're alive. Because Jesus is alive, he always makes intercession for you before God. And so my encouragement to you today is I hope that you'll take some time to remember what it was like when the truth of Jesus became your reality. I hope you'll take time to remember when the gospel of Jesus Christ showed brightly into your heart and you became alive. You understood the gospel and believed. And I would also encourage you to share that story with someone. Share the story of God's goodness in your life with someone who you think needs to hear it. And maybe you don't have anybody in mind right away. So pray about it. Pray to God. Ask God to put someone on your heart and your mind that you can share your story of God's goodness in your life with. And maybe it's somebody who needs to hear the gospel or just needs to be encouraged today. It could be a family member, it could be a friend or a coworker, it could be somebody within the church, somebody who's a part of your koinonia group. I don't know. But share your story. Share the story of God's goodness in your life through the work of Jesus Christ with somebody this week. And be encouraged by that. And well, finally, this is what I'll say. Be encouraged. Even in these strange times, even as we anxiously await to be back together, be encouraged because Jesus is still King. And so I'll leave you with that. I hope that in Christ you are blessed, and I am praying that we will be together again soon.